Back on the podcast, really happy to be joined by Tyler Tynes of The Ringer. Tyler wrote a story at The Ringer last week that really appealed to me because you think it's a story about the difficulty, not just in the NFL, but in college football, with advancement of qualified black coaches. But I'll tell you why I get into it, but I'll describe the story a little bit. It's called The Game Within a Game. And the subhead is a new NFL hiring cycle is underway, but the same problems persist for the league's black coaches trying to advance in an industry designed to obstruct their upward mobility. So anyway, Tyler, welcome and congratulations on a really thought-provoking story.
Yo, thanks, man. Thanks for having me. You know, I ain't never been on the Peter King podcast. So I heard it's an honor. So I try to live up to the bill.
You're good to come on. So, Tyler, one of the things that I like when I used to run this website called the MMQB, one of the things I used to tell the writers is, don't be afraid to really get down in the weeds. And you know, one of our writers was doing a story, Jenny Varentis was doing a story about the last game that Bill Belichick and Nick Saban coached together with the Cleveland Browns. And so I said, you know, get down in the weeds and really get to know like who was in that game and who played and what the circumstances were, what was the weather and all that stuff. And so, you know, we talked about it a little bit. We found out, hey, Louis Riddick started at safety in that game. And Louis Riddick has a memory that he remembers every snap. And so Jenny really got him to discuss a lot about those two guys. And so that's kind of what I mean. And most stories, honestly, Tyler, about the black coach issue are, you know, either, you know, anonymous coaches railing at the system, or Troy Vincent saying, we got to fix this, or Roger Goodell saying something, but they don't really get down in the weeds. And so I really liked what you did in this story because you got down in the weeds. And I'm just going to read. I really like the way you led the story. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph in your story, and then we'll get into it a little bit, okay? So here's the first graph of your story. Entering Alonzo Carter's domain is a high-pressure proposition. On a Zoom call this summer, his boisterous personality practically burst through my screen. We all stressing, he assured the nervous participants who joined the call. But at least you got to laugh a little bit, brother. Carter communicates with enthusiasm and ease. It's easy to see how he excelled in his first profession as a backup dancer for MC Hammer. Currently, he works as an assistant football coach at San Jose State, where he's regarded as one of the best recruiters in the Mountain West Conference. He invited me to attend what he calls Zoom therapy, a gathering of hundreds of black football coaches from all over the country. In the meeting, coaches share hopeful stories of progress, but they are more likely to lament regressive hiring practices and other conditions that keep so many of them underemployed. So I never in a million years thought I would read a story about the problems of hiring black coaches in the NFL. And the lead of the story would be about a guy from San Jose State, you know, who I've never heard of in my life. So I just would love to hear how you, found Alonzo and how you sort of developed that part of the story, which really the roots of this dig deep into college football and even going down into high school football, because so many black coaches feel that sort of repressive atmosphere in career advancement.
Absolutely. And so it's absolutely multi-pronged. And so for me, I'm not a football writer. right? Like I spent the last 5-6 years really digging into the intersection of race, politics, and sports, really the politics of sports. And a lot of that has to deal with institutional racism and on-field racism in terms of professional football, right? And everywhere we think about football, because if we think about football from, the way that Teddy Roosevelt sold football to the United States from his purchase presidency at the beginning of the 20th century, it is about muscular Christianity. It is this idea that there's a man in every county in America that cares about the pigskin. And that is something that, at least as the NFL has sold it, is a unifier, the great meritocracy that could be the world's greatest game. That's the bedrock of how we do this reporting, right? And so somebody like Alonzo Carter, at least for me and my profile and my portfolio, is that it's so many different Black coaches and so many different Black geniuses and laureates around every single sport that in nooks and crannies around the country, I've been talking to them for months, for years sometimes, academics in the same space. And Alonzo Carter was a guy who was getting a little bit of press, at the beginning of the year as the pandemic sort of kind of took hold, as a guy who the head coach of San Jose State told his staff, make use of this time because we're not getting it back. And out of nowhere, you had 35 coaches on the West Coast doing these Zoom therapies because they were upset because there was a running back coach group that was doing the same thing all around the country. So now you've got a story out West. Then you got a story in the Athletic. Then you got a story and so on and so on and so forth. Now I've got coaches telling me, hey man, I can't talk today. I'm going to the Zoom therapy. What you mean going to the Zoom therapy? What's that supposed to be? And so eventually I ran down Alonzo Carter around August, and we had about an hour, 2-hour chat. And then I took in a few of these Zoom therapies. But, before that, the onus of the story was that obviously in May, the NFL rolled out this policy where they wanted to incentivize owners into hiring non-white talent, both on the sidelines and the C-suites. Automatically, as somebody who did a very similar story last year, centered around the occupational mobility data that the NFL pays for every year since 2013, it was startling to me. Talking to so many folks in the NFL was startling to them. And given what this year was in terms of how we generally consider Blackness in the United States, how we generally think of protest in the United States, these folks are already on edge on top of an election coming up. And so to have this was just a magnificent slap in their face. And so it's sort of, we work backwards. The main event happened, and you have that as the bedrock for why people should care about this. And then you filled in the gaps, right? You put the people next to the issue. And so that's something specifically my editor, Connor Nevins, who used to work at ESPN, deeply cares about, is that for me, I care about the policy. I care about the numbers. I care about the stats. I care about how we are going to unravel this idea of white supremacy in our athletics. But for him, he wants to put a person and a face to the name. And so that was it. Alonzo Carter, Kefense Henson, Mike London, Willie Stein, so many of these guys and hundreds.
Mike London, who's now the coach at William and Mary, right?
Exactly. It's not a coach at William and Mary, who came from Howard. So many of these guys who either we haven't heard from in 2 or 3 years or haven't been in the NFL, like Hugh Jackson for a few years, are all on this call. Brian Flores, Anthony Lynn, Mike Tomlin, Tony Dungy, the luminaries of the Black side of this sport, they all care about what Alonzo Carter got to say. And so if y'all care about it, I'm going to care about it. And so I sat on these Zoom meetings. I talked to Kefense for an hour, talked to Alonzo for an hour, and we boiled down really the nitty gritty of an idea that I've always understood at a basic level, which is the NFL, like any American institution, does not care enough about the Black body within its services, both the labor force and those outside of it. Simple premise, let's go from there.
So when you listen to this, I take it you really, I don't know if you were overwhelmed or underwhelmed, but did you sense a lot of anger, or did you sense, hey, let's try to solve this? What did you sense? Resignation? What was the emotion you heard in these Zoom calls?
Folks was pissed. Folks was pissed because the reality too is that, there have been other journalists who have been on these calls, Sports Illustrated, The Athletic, and so many more. And the reality of the situation too is that you are talking about a group at sometimes as small as 35, at sometimes as massive as 700, all on a Zoom call, giving a specific level of trust to me or to whoever the journalist might be. And just like the NFL on the sidelines, the CCs being too white, journalism is also massively too white, massively too male. The Guardian said in the fall of 2018 that 88% of jobs in journalism go to cis hetero white men. And so if that is the truth, we have a problem everywhere in our American institutions. And so Alonzo Carter came to me very candidly and he said, look, I'm fine giving you this interview, but I don't know about this Zoom call. We've had journalists who've played with us in the past. I don't know how this is going. And that is a common retort in my reporting from when I was a newspaper kid, going up and down blocks in Atlantic City, New Jersey, covering crime in courts, to right now as a national reporter of the last 5 or 6 years. And so I'm always confronted with this issue. And so I tell them the same thing I tell everybody else. Look, it's always going to be another journalist. It's always going to be another story, but I'm in front of you right now. You can put it in my hands. You don't have to, but no matter what, this story is getting told with or without you. Let me know how you want to proceed. So all I could do is tell you the truth, give you my most honest American truth and yours. And so sat in on those calls, watched them pour the whiskey, light the cigars, and talk about something that is obviously very, very, very near and dear to a lot of different hearts when you're not white, is the reality of racism within the United States. And so we got it popping from there.
Do you sense that this level of anger, this level of resignation has hit home at all with people in the National Football League? And will this hiring cycle be any different, do you believe?
You see, and this is the thing, right, Peter, is that they've always, no matter what none of these executives can tell you, they've always known this has been a problem. I mean, the first black coach was Fritz Pollard in 1921. The second was Art Shell in 1988, right? There have been less than 50 black coaches in NFL history. There have been more than 115 white coaches getting second opportunities just since 2000. And so that's the issue. The issue isn't like, oh, well, there's a pipeline. You have to go through the proper, protocols to make sure that you're ready for the job. We don't do these things for white coaches. We don't have the Bill Walsh Fellowship for white coaches. We don't have these internships and programs for white coaches. We just believe dudes like Joe Judge and Cliff Kingsbury and Matt LaFleur and Zach, blanking on his name.
Taylor.
Yeah, Zach Taylor. Guys like this are automatically equipped because of what they look like. Right. But Tony Elliott don't got no job in the NFL, but Joe Brady found one. Right. You're saying Mike Locksley don't got no job in the NFL, but Cliff Kingsbury found one. It was the impetus of the story we did last year where so many black coaches were fed up with the idea that Cliff Kingsbury got this job and Sean McVay were getting jobs like this, where there was never going to be, as one academic put it to me, a black wonderkin. When you see the McVays in the cookie cutter type of league that we have here, you never saw that an Eric Bieniemy or a John Embry or, a Leslie Frazier or anyone like that being regarded as a wonderkin like these 30-year-old white guys were. And so the resignation has always been there. The anger has always been there. I think the difference that I try to pride myself in my reporting, at least, is like, unless somebody dying or unless you're afraid to lose your job, ain't no reason you shouldn't go on the record.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of times, last year I had Eric Bieniemy on the podcast because, quite honestly, I know Andy Reid pretty well, and he really wanted Eric's story to get out there, and he really wanted to try to help Eric get a job. Now, it turns out he didn't get a job, and when Eric was on the podcast, he was very, very careful. He was very careful because I'm not sure it was because he didn't want to piss anybody off, but I think what he wanted to do is to talk for 30 minutes in the way that an owner who might listen to the podcast would want to hear, And what I find interesting about that, and of course, that's very, very logical, but also, of course, Eric Bieniemy is not going to speak that way in a team meeting. He's going to talk. He's going to keep it real, in a team meeting. But let's. You mentioned Tony Elliott's name. I want you to tell, because I bet more than half of the listeners to this podcast, they don't even know who Tony Elliott is. Yet he has universal respect around the NFL from the coaches who I know. Whenever his name comes up, oh yeah, Tony Elliott. Tell everybody who Tony Elliott is.
Clemson offensive coordinator, two national championships, 40 years old, used to play at Clemson. He's the architect of modern offense, right? He is the Eric Bieniemy in so many ways of the college game, just like Mike Locksley was to a certain extent when he was with Alabama. And so there are so many of these guys who are lingering in high school football, who are lingering in college football. And they, to a certain extent, you think of a guy like David Shaw, who's the head coach of Stanford, who's been the architect of so many of the great offensive linemen and quarterbacks like, Andrew Luck that we've seen come through the NFL. And I talked to him last year for a very similar story. And he was very clear, as he's been in private and in public, like, why would I leave the college game? Why would I leave my castle in Stanford, California,
Yeah.
to come to the NFL where I've already been for a feeling or a lack of appreciation? That's where so many of these guys are. I mean, think about dudes like Keith Armstrong, who's down in Tampa Bay, been on special teams for 27 years, right? Like you think of guys like that, where so many Black folks around this league have been recycled and reshuffled into position coaches, offensive coordinators, and so on and so on and so forth, just hoping for a piece of hope, just hoping for a piece of pride to say they can go home back to their families and say, I made it, right? Yeah. Quincy Henson, again, a receivers coach at Oregon State's been in the game for almost 20 years. Alonzo Carter, paying out of his own pocket to sleep on hotel floors to get coaches to notice him. And his claim to fame right now, outside of being a backup dancer for MC Hammer once upon a time, is being one of the better recruiters in the Mountain West Conference, right? Like, these are guys, lifers, who played the sport, who teach the sport, who are never going to have an opportunity to be at the higher end of what football could afford them and their families. And again, while we are railing against professional football and railing against football, and as they should, this is a symptom of every single American institution, journalism included.
What current head coach in the NFL do you think pisses off the Black coaching fraternity more than any other one? Is there one that they hold up and say, how did Joe X get this job?
And it's funny. Every year is different because every year it's a new name. Last year was definitely Cliff Kingsbury, right? Year before that, it was probably Sean McVay. This year was definitely Joe Judge. I mean, again, every single year, these guys are like, really, man? Y'all picked him? And so this year is probably Joe Judge. And so, again, it goes on and on and again. Like, why are guys like Eric Bieniemy not getting jobs, or at least getting the official looks? Why are guys like Chris Richard out the league, right? Like that becomes the question again. Is that like I think it's only been 2 or 3 coaches, and I'm paraphrasing here, in the history of the sport that are non-white have been reshuffled to get a third job in the NFL. It's over a dozen white coaches who've gotten a third job in the NFL, right? If we even go to the second number, less than 20, less than 10 get a second job if you are specifically a Black coach in the NFL. More than 50 white people are getting those jobs. And so every single year, the breakdowns are abysmal. White people are the face of what we believe the higher levels of coaching and executive work in the NFL are. And you have plenty of owners who will tell you that Black is not good for business. And yet, as you look all around the NFL, the starlets in the pocket are Black. The starlets, when it comes to thinking about how the game is moving forward, are Black. And so at a certain point in time, you have to ask yourself a question. If there is no intellectual reason why these people are not getting jobs, if there is no regular reason why these people are not getting job performance, anything like that, right? The numbers show that Black coaches, by and large, since Johnny Cochran and Cyrus Mary unveiled this research from the University of Pennsylvania in 2003, that they were winning more frequently than white coaches across the years. So if it's not performance, it is not anything intellectual, the answer is centered wholly around racism. And you can't defeat racism unless the people in power, the white gatekeepers and power brokers, are usurped from their purchase, and the whole thing magnanimously changes.
See, that's really the biggest issue, isn't it? Like, until Jason Wright got his job in Washington, the owners are white. The decision makers for the absolute most part are white. And that's why this is going to be such, a walk across a very long bridge. I'll never forget when Mike Tomlin got hired in Pittsburgh. I remember asking Dan Rooney after it, because I had heard of Mike Tomlin, but I didn't know him. I barely knew who he was. And I remember talking to Dan Rooney, and one of the things he said is, because obviously the Rooney Rule at that time was, effective, but not wildly so. And he just said to me, all you have to do is sit in a room with Mike Tomlin to know that he was going to be a coach in the next year or so. And was this a year maybe early? Might have been. But we're never going to get a chance to hire him if we wait a year or two, because someone else is going to hire him. So Let's hire this really young guy. He said we did it with Chuck Noll. Let's hire this young guy. And if we have to have some growing pains, we will. But, the incredible thing is he never had growing pains. And now Mike Tomlin just this week passed Tony Dungy for most victories in NFL history by a black coach, which is, a sign that if you go into an interview truly open-minded and not just to satisfy the Rooney Rule, there'd be a heck of a lot more black coaches in the league.
And this is that was the conclusionary point that I made in our story last year when I talked to Byron Leftwich and talked to Brian Flores and talked to David Shaw and talked to all these same people to put them on record as well, is that if David Shaw couldn't convince you that black is good for business, then what will? If Fritz Pollard couldn't convince you, Mike Tomlin couldn't convince you, if Tony Dungy, if Doug Williams, if none of the luminaries of the sport, people who have gone to unassailable heights in this sport can convince you that black is good for business, at least at the lowest point possible, worth equity in the game, then we are talking about a very, very wrong issue here, right? And something that needs to be completely stripped down, unrooted from the system, and rebuilt wholly, right? Because the idea around the NFL, when you talk to these people, you ask Anthony Lynn what happened to him the first time he went to try to go get a coaching job, right? Like, the problem isn't that these people aren't qualified. These people don't need a pipeline. These people don't need extra programs to show they're equipped. Y'all need to just make some space and let folk not only in the door, but also at the table. And so that becomes the issue, right? Like John Wooten said this to me, in the closing section of the story from last week, is that, it's not enough where you have the Rooney Rule where people, are getting back alley calls and, being taken out into the hallway after the meeting just to pick somebody else. And so you have to respond to this with your fist balled up and ready to fight, because that's the only way this thing changes. The only way this thing changes, right? And paraphrasing, that's what Hugh Jackson said to that room of the J.W. Marriott during the Combine. It's not the race that you're running. It's the race of the person. And so at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself the question, if it's not performance and there is no intellectual argument, the only thing that you can probably bring yourself back to is that this is racist, and that the system where this lies has an institutional problem that can only be fixed if it is rebuilt. Not piecemeal pieces, not snail form progressivism. The whole thing got to come down and a new thing got to be put up.
You had a very interesting point in your story about, I thought about James Baldwin. You made the point that Vic Fangio talked about what a meritocracy the coaching business was. And you quoted James Baldwin as saying, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you do not see. And so, I'm sure I'm as guilty as the next white person who grew up in white bread America. We didn't grow up. I grew up with in a high school of 1,500 people, there were 4 black kids. And when I went to college at Ohio University, there's probably, 6 or 8% minority population. And so, so many of us, both in the media and I think also people in the football world, basically are coming from a position of just whiteness. And a lot of times I think we need to be forced to see things that might be a little bit uncomfortable. That's one of the things I liked about the story. It forces somebody like me to see things that are uncomfortable. I know this problem exists, but sometimes you need to get beat over the head with it a little bit more than you normally do. And that's why I think the story did a great service.
This is the thing that I kind of always say to folks is that, I'm born and bred in North Philadelphia. You're saying I went to a private high school, St. Joe's Prep, the private school, the university in the back shout that Jesuits raised me on education. You're saying I went to school, if it was a class 222 that graduated, 12 folks wasn't white and maybe 5 of them was black. And we was all from the north side of Philadelphia, more or less. And so the thing about it is that the onus just ain't on black folks to police this, to let y'all know when something is messed up. You equally got to see it yourself. And just like this year, we out of time. We don't need no allies. I need an accomplice in this fight. I need y'all to be as angry as me, even more angry than me when these things and these transgressions happen to me, because racism is a man-made, self-built problem that is not from Black people. It came from white folks. And so it's going to take white folks to tear down a problem that y'all created. And so that's the thing, right? Is that like, it don't matter how much I'm trying to make you see, you got to see it yourself. I grew up in a city of football favorite folks who love their Eagles and love their high school sports as well. I love my footballs next to the other person. So I'm guilty of signing up for the American blood sport myself. But at the end of the day, this thing isn't perfect. And I like football because at the end of the day, I can go and talk to these players, go talk to these coaches, go talk to these managers and look them in the face and tell them something stink. You know what I'm saying? And it stank all up and down the NFL, Peter. So we got something to fix here, right? So as a fan of the sport, I want the sport to be better. As a fan of the sport, I want the sport to be more inclusive. As a fan of the sport, I want to see places like Baltimore not have a grouping of Black fans who run away from the stadium because Joe Flacco became the starter, once somebody else was. Same in Washington, same in Philadelphia, right? I don't want to see those things. But specifically as a journalist and as a critic of the athletics that I find myself around, this is going to be what I'm doing as long as I can, because very frequently, we do not have national outlets that allocate the funds to care about this intersection and put the time in to force these people, these managers, these owners, these coaches, these executives to give a damn about the Black people they employ. And that's more than name only. And that has to change first and foremost.
You mentioned Baltimore. I find Baltimore a very interesting crucible for this, not as far as coaching, but as far as Lamar Jackson taking over for Joe Flacco. Yeah. And, my little Baltimore story is that last year I took the train down. I went to cover their game against the Patriots at their stadium. And I'm walking, I get dropped off by the cab, and I'm walking through the parking lots around M&T Bank Stadium. And I said to myself, this is really noticeable. Well, what was noticeable? The fact that at least a third of the people tailgating in the parking lots were Black.
Folk come out for their own.
I can tell you as somebody who's, the Ravens have been great for, not great, but they've mattered for 20 years. Okay. So I've been to a lot of games there. I never saw anything like that. I mentioned it to somebody in their front office, and they said, yeah, that's one of the byproducts of this that is so incredibly important, that we're actually reaching people in Baltimore we've never reached before. I found that really, really interesting.
I went to Baltimore in the middle of last year while doing a separate coaching story similar to this, to do a story on Lamar Jackson. Yeah. Talked to a lot of people in his circle, went down to Florida for it as well, but spent 2 or 3 trips in Baltimore, on multiple days in Baltimore. And as somebody who has a reporting background with sourcing in Baltimore from the Freddie Gray killing and things of that nature, Baltimore is like home to me. It's one of the cities in the country that feels like home to me. And it's very similar to Philadelphia's makeup. Being at training camp for 2 weeks and seeing some differences there, talking to, dozens of Black fans who were in those stands for Lamar Jackson, who were tired of Flacco, who never felt like the organization or the franchise cared about them as a fan base, talking to the head of security there, who had been there for 20 years, saying how Lamar had been here for 2 years and he's already at every single charity drive in West Baltimore where Freddie Gray was killed. Yeah. Talking about how when he's driving up to the stadium, he's kicking it with the Squeegee Boys down by M&T. Talking about how Black folks are going to clubs near M&T, getting Lamar Jackson gear in the middle of the night during Christmas. And so it's just, you saw it in Washington. It happened in Philly every time we had a Black quarterback down, growing up with Dante, Michael Vick and guys like that, Dante, you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? And so it was things like that like, it makes the thing, right? Like, we're going to come out for our own, but if you give us somebody like Lamar Jackson, I'll be at every game. I'll be at every game. Randall Cunningham is what I meant, but I'll be at every game. That's just, we're going to support our own, whether we like it or we hate it. It's the same thing with, you look at Jason Wright in Washington. These aren't, it's great that he got the job, but for him to be the first Black person in that position, it's not good enough. Andrew Berry, who's over there in Cleveland, it's not good enough, right? The guys down there, Chris Greer in Miami, it's not good enough. It's never going to be good enough until we have an equitable piece of the pie. We ain't never had that in NFL history.
Tell me what you think happens this year with Eric Bieniemy.
Hope he gets a job. Hope he gets a job. He's been the best guy on the market for almost 2-3 years now. Hope he gets a job. I can't tell you what's going to happen because, again, here's the thing, right? Like, even if Eric Bieniemy gets a job, how many more Eric Bieniemys will he get a job, right? And so Tynes and Coates interviewed Michelle Obama around 2009 in this Atlantic story called The American Girl. And one thing she said that has always stuck with me about that is that so many white people saw the Obamas as this like magnificent, wonderkin, super spade brand of blackness they had never seen before in their lives. And 1 year into the presidency, Michelle Obama told Tynes and Coates, there's 40 Michelle and Barack Obamas on every corner of the south side of Chicago. They just haven't gotten a chance to show y'all who they are, right? And that's from systemic racism, that's from redlining, that's from so many different pieces of injustice that keep the black body indentured in America and throughout American history. And so how many more Eric Bieniemys are there? How many more young black journalists could be in these newsrooms that are not there? How many more Chris Greers could there be in front offices, right? Like that's the end of the issue. It's not just when Eric Bieniemy gets a head coaching job. How long can he keep it? When will you root him out, right? Just like John Embry was in Colorado years ago. So that becomes the question. I hope he gets a job. I hope everybody who is a candidate that should probably be a head coach of the NFL gets a job. I hope we cure racism. I know we won't. I know.
Hey, look, I'll tell you what sort of Cris Collinsworth told me this a couple of weeks ago. I think he's absolutely right. You know what I hope? I hope that Eric Bieniemy coaches the New York Jets and they draft Trevor Lawrence, and Eric Bieniemy and Trevor Lawrence become Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes.
No. I hope the Jets go get Eric Bieniemy and they go get Justin Fields. I hope something like that.
Yeah.
I hope something like that. I ain't rooting for Trevor Lawrence to get a job. He'd be all right. I hope Eric Bieniemy and Justin Fields.
Well, Justin Fields is going to get a job. Justin Fields, look, it could be by a year ago before Tua Tagovailoa got injured. It was even when Joe Burrow was doing well, everybody said, Tua's the top pick. And look, both those guys are going to get picked in the top 5. What I always tell, I remember sitting with Matt Ryan in what year it was, 2008. And we were just talking and I said, you'd be better off if people really didn't like you. Because then you get picked lower in the draft.
That's the truth.
Dan Marino gets picked at the end of the first round by the Dolphins. And it turns out to be a lot better for him. Even though he doesn't win a Super Bowl, he's on a competitive team every year. And that's one of the things. Hey, the great thing for Mahomes, and I thought it was going to be good for Watson, is that good franchises traded up to get them.
Right.
Where they weren't totally bereft of talent. And that's always my fear. I think Joe Burrow is going to, after about 3 years, he's going to be just so beaten down in Cincinnati. But again, look, I just hope that, I hope that Bieniemy gets a job, and I really hope that whoever his choice of quarterback is, I wouldn't mind seeing Bieniemy get the Houston job, quite honestly, because I would love to see him. There's going to be tremendous obstacles in Houston because they don't have draft picks. The cap is screwed up. Right. Their talent is down, but they got the quarterback. You can have all sorts of obstacles in front of you, but if you got the quarterback, you got a chance. And if you don't have the quarterback, you're never going to have a chance. So I don't know. But, hey, I just, I hope that the Bieniemy thing ends and ends quickly.
I hope it does too. But the question is, who's going to be the next one?
Yeah.
Because once Eric Bieniemy finally gets a job, which, again, he should get a job. Once he finally gets a job, the question becomes, who's the next person that did not get a job? Right? Like if Jeff Fisher could have 16 bad years, Jim Caldwell should come back. Marvin Lewis should come back, right? Like there's a slew of folks around the league who probably deserve these jobs. And there's a slew of folks around this league that keep finding their ways into these jobs that ain't the folks who need them.
Tyler Tynes from The Ringer, thanks so much for taking the time. I urge everybody to go to theringer.com and read Tyler's story about the dearth of black coaches and how it just simply is not getting better. Tyler, thanks so much.
Yeah, big dog. I appreciate you, man.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.